The year is 781. You live in a small village in the Northern Isles of Scotland, and your life is a simple one, or it was until the day you began communing with spirits and other worldly creatures. The voices in your head become a constant presence, and the other people in your village regard you with a mixture of fear and awe. Surely this is either a powerful gift granted to you by the gods, or a deadly curse that will bring inevitable ruin down upon you and your village. What doesn't occur to anyone in this village, however, is the truth. You are one of the countless early people who suffered from a mental illness over 1,000 years before there would be any context or treatment for what you're going through. And if that sounds like a tumultuous and complicated struggle, then you're starting to have some idea of the feelings presented by Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice.
It's almost a cliche about indie games at this point, right? That they have a tendency to tackle complicated real-world topics like trauma or mental health. Some only touch on it briefly, while others, like Celeste for example, take a bit deeper of a dive, or tie those explorations into the gameplay. Lots of indie games have been successful at tackling these subjects, whether through a broader approach that pleads for more general awareness about the vast range of mental health difficulties that many people go through, or by getting incredibly specific. Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice puts a spotlight on the condition of psychosis, and then casts out every single element of the game through that lens. So while it may not be the absolute best overall game to tackle these subjects, I do think it may be the gold standard when it comes to portraying mental illness in video games. So how does that affect something like the gameplay or completion? It's a good question, and the only way to know for sure is to dive into the underworld alongside Senua, because this is the Completionist, where we don't just beat the games, we complete them, no matter what the cost.
Yes! All glory goes to the winner!
Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice is very much a story-driven game, and the story benefits from both being straightforward and disorienting at the same time. It stars Senua, a warrior who is descending into the depths of Helhiem, the Norse conception of hell, in order to rescue the soul of Dillion, her lover, who has been brutally murdered by the Norsemen. As she carries Dillion's severed head deeper and deeper into the depths of Helhiem, she is confronted not only by the various monsters and obstacles pulled straight from Norse myth, but by her own tortured past and illness. Senua's abusive father believed that both Senua and her mother were cursed, and the subsequent isolation of Senua caused her condition to worsen. Now, as she ventures into Helhiem, she is pursued not only by a creeping darkness that represents her past, but by the voices and visions that filter her perception of the world through her psychosis. In fact, almost every presentational aspect of the game is filtered through this lens, and it's here that the game's biggest strength shines through: its incredible dedication to research. The time period and locations feel incredibly specific and detailed, but it's especially clear that the devs at Ninja Theory dedicated much of their effort to nailing the depiction of psychosis, even for a game set in a time where there was no word for it. They not only consulted with doctors and mental health professionals, but those who experienced psychosis in order to make sure that the portrayal was accurate. And that attention shows itself everywhere, in the story, in the level design, and even in the gameplay. The game is highly experiential, putting the player in Senua's shoes by making you hear what she hears and see what she sees, regardless of whether or not any of it is real. What matters most is that it's real to Senua and her perception of the world, and therefore it has to be real to the player. One of the coolest examples of this is the voices.
They look dimly upon the druids, like her father, Zinbel.
Senua has many voices in her head, and they're chattering pretty much constantly. Sometimes they encourage her, and sometimes they call her weak, or tell her that she's never going to make it. In combat, they might tell you when an enemy's behind you, or they might be lying. And when played with headphones, the sensory immersion here is almost overwhelming. The same goes for the visuals. The dark and decaying world of Helhiem may be a result of Senua's condition, but that doesn't make it any less oppressive and all-consuming. The flashbacks that fill in Senua's past incorporate live action that's overlaid with the graphics. And every time it happens, the player can feel Senua's two competing perceptions of the world butting up against each other. The game works so well as an experience because each and every element is about making the player understand what Senua herself experiences. When she hears the voice of her terrible father, it's not just a memory or a storytelling device, but a part of Senua's experience that she is carrying with her in an incredibly literal sense. The same goes for Dillion, whose brief appearances literally lighten up the game's palette for a moment to reflect the way that the relationship helped to lighten Senua's burden. Even though the story features grotesque gods and monsters, it feels incredibly grounded because it's all rooted in that specific feeling of experience and going through what Senua is going through. Whether or not her journey into Helhiem is real in a literal sense means nothing because she comes to terms with her experience of the world alongside the player. Each step in Helhiem is a step inward, and each whisper from one of the voices teaches us more about the many facets of our hero, which is why it's almost hard to talk about the sound and the graphics and the story separately because they're all designed to create a unified experience, especially if played with headphones in the dark, which I can't recommend enough. Because the miracle of this game's presentation is that even if your experience of the world is wildly different from Senua's, it's able to put you in her shoes for a few hours, with all of the fear and grief and even joy that entails.
When talking about indie games that explore mental illness, it's easy to pat yourself on the back or pat the developers on the back and inflate the game's self-importance. Because after all, this is still a video game that features sword fights and puzzles and all that good stuff, and I am going to get there. But what I want to talk about real quick is why I think this stuff is so important, especially when portrayed in the way that it is here. Roger Ebert once called movies empathy machines, and even though he was one of those people who was unwilling to see video games as art, I actually think he gave us the perfect term for discussing games like this. By making the player's experiences with the game echo Senua's experiences, games like this let us have a small bit of understanding when it comes to how some people see and hear the world, and that's a huge deal. Playing this game is fun and stressful and exciting, and all those great things that a game can be. But the reason why I keep using the word experience is because it either lets the player viscerally feel an experience that is new to them, or lets them see their own experiences echoed in a way that rings true to them. So is this game automatically good because it's about someone who struggles with mental health? Not necessarily, but like Celeste, the other example that I keep falling back to, it allows the gameplay to function as an empathy machine. Through playing the game, you feel the game, which makes all those elements like story and gameplay and music, which can sometimes feel disparate and isolated, instead feel unified and complete. Because in the end, good or bad, it's all Senua.
In talking about the presentation, I mentioned a lot that it was largely about creating a visceral, immersive experience through the visuals, story, and sound. And the same is also 100% true of the gameplay, combat, and level design, which may not be quite as successful as those other elements when considered in isolation, but worked very well for me as a piece of the overall tapestry. A big part of that is that you can absolutely feel that intent behind each choice of planting the player in Senua's mind. It all feels so deliberate, and even when the combat doesn't feel as deep as it might in other games, it never pulled me out. There is one mechanic in particular that I want to focus on because it's incredibly fascinating and gets to the heart of that developer intent. Throughout Hellblade, there's no HUD or on-screen button prompts. Instead, the mechanics are called out by the voices in Senua's head in order to maintain that immersion. But there's one major exception to that rule, where the game stops to put text on screen and explain a mechanic to you. It shows up after Senua experiences death for the first time, which is presented in this game as a glimpse of possible futures rather than an actual death. But each time Senua watches herself die, she notices an encroaching rot on one of her arms. And I'm going to read exactly what it says. It says, "The dark rot will grow each time you fail. If the rot reaches Senua's head, her quest is over and all progress will be lost." And sure enough, each time Senua dies, the rot moves a little further up her arm. The promise of that scary bit of text seems to be that there's a permadeath mechanic, and then if you allow Senua to die a certain number of times, then your save file will be erased. Yes, Hellblade is a short game, but that's still terrifying, especially from a completionist's perspective. And here's the thing, it's not true. It's impossible to die enough times that the rot reaches Senua's head, and this led to some debate about how fair it is for the developers to straight up lie to the player like this. But the more I thought about it, the more it makes sense with the game's intent. The developers did not want a permadeath mechanic, they wanted the feeling of a permadeath mechanic. Rather than punishing the player for gameplay mistakes, they wanted to make the player feel the dread and anxiety that Senua is feeling. And since the deaths are meant to be glimpses of what could have been, this makes sense because we're not feeling her actual death, but her fear of death. I mentioned before that the voices in Senua's head can't always be trusted. Yet this moment means that even the game itself can't be trusted, because Ninja Theory rightfully knew that this would elicit the same feelings the character is going through. And sure, once I looked into it and found out that it wasn't possible to have my save file erased, I relaxed a little bit. But every time that rot moved up Senua's arm, I still felt a jolt of fear from when the game broke its own rules to put text on screen and tell me how screwed I was. The game's two major gameplay modes, fighting and puzzle solving, are also about rooting you in that feeling. Most of the puzzles are about finding runes and patterns in Senua's surroundings. And when it comes to puzzles in games, they're fine. Not spectacular, but sometimes oddly satisfying to find the patterns. But they got even cooler when I read that the ideas for the puzzles all flowed directly from Senua's psychosis. That feeling of finding patterns that may or may not be there isn't about whether they hold up as video game puzzles, but whether they hold up as a reflection and visual representation of Senua's experience. The same goes for the combat, which is pretty bare bones when compared to other games of this kind. You have a heavy attack, a light attack, a parry, along with the focus ability that slows down time and makes some shadowy enemies corporeal so Senua can hit them. But again, the real success of the combat here isn't measured in how complex it is, but how it feels. As the game goes on, Senua faces more and more enemies at a time, which echoes the overwhelming fear and despair that's always surrounding her. Finally achieving enough focus to slow things down and get the upper hand feels like coming up for air, as though Senua's achieved a moment of clarity that lets her breathe for a second. Everyone who has ever dealt with mental health issues knows this feeling, and what a life raft it can be. So to see it etched in hack and slash gameplay is honestly pretty wild. Because instead of being complicated by mechanics, the combat is complicated by sensory input, like the voices that might be lying or might be helping you out, or by the camera's narrow focus, which makes it really easy for Senua to get surrounded if the player isn't careful. Even the boss fights against grotesque versions of figures from Norse myth are mechanically similar to the others, but with some kind of emotion or visual change-up layered on top. There's not much exploration or collectibles, but there are lore stones that fill both Senua and the player in on some of the details of the world. Some of them are hidden and some are in plain sight, but they're all about adding a depth of feeling by giving additional context. And each of the regions of Helhiem have something to make it feel different, either emotionally or mechanically, like a trial in which Senua has to navigate absolute darkness by sound, while avoiding nightmarish blob beasts that she can almost see. And it's honestly terrifying.
Sometimes in a game, when the player is terrified or stressed or excited, it's just that, an external feeling created by the game and transmitted directly to whoever's playing it. But here, it's all routed through Senua. When I was overwhelmed in combat, it's because the game wanted me to know that she was overwhelmed. When I was freaking out having to dash from torch to avoid monsters in the darkness, it was her fear that I was feeling. And that's why I think this game is a huge success, even if I wouldn't necessarily say that each individual element is the best I've ever seen. The visuals are good, but I've seen better. The combat is fun, but it's not amazing. And when it comes to the developer intent of making the player identify with the game's character, it's hard to imagine how they could have been more successful. It's a short, bite-sized game, but it's incredibly dense and potent because each moment lands with the weight that its complex subject matter demands.
You may have noticed that I didn't mention completion much so far, and that's because there's not a lot here to complete. The game is mostly focused on being an individual experience with a beginning, middle, and an end. But I am the completionist, so I think it's worth talking about the few completion elements that are here, and if it's possible to make room for completion in a game like this. There are only 2 things in Hellblade that I would even come close to calling collectibles: the aforementioned lore stones, and the hidden faces of Galena, Senua's mother, which prompts memories of their relationship. Let's start with the lore stones. There are 44 of them placed throughout Helhiem, and each one has a handy little ring around it that keeps track of how many you found in each of the game's areas. For the most part, these are missable, and you can't go back and get all of them later on, but progress is thankfully retained across playthroughs. They exist largely to provide backstory and also to prompt the player to walk around and explore a little bit. And that's it. Finding all of them unlocks an achievement and also a brief cutscene before the final boss, which makes a lot of sense because there's not really anything else to unlock. No secret weapons or armor or levels, because it's not that kind of game. Instead, you get a bit more story and a bit more understanding of the characters, because that's the currency that Hellblade deals in. Same goes for the 8 visages of Senua's mom, which are mostly a little more hidden than the lore stones. Again, there's not really anything unlocked here beyond a bit more time spent on Senua's relationship with her mother, who shared her mental illness. With the faces, there's not even an achievement or a way to keep track of them. And again, this is okay. The brief cutscenes are the reward. Now, do I think that Ninja Theory should have put a little more in collectibles or more optional stuff? Or that they should add this element into the sequel, Senua Saga? I honestly don't know. I think if the second game wants to be an expansion of the ideas presented here, then that's definitely one way to widen out the scope and make it feel larger or more involved. But is that even where their focus should be? Or would it detract from the more experiential nature of the game? I'm always down for collectibles and side quests, but I can see why they might feel out of place here. And in a game this short, there's no reason for them other than a potential excuse for replayability, which actually brings me to the achievements themselves. Hellblade is not really a game that's designed to be replayed. Once you've experienced it from the very beginning to the end, you've gotten most of what it has to offer. And to play it again would be like rewatching a film. You know what's coming, so you can soak up individual moments more, but aren't necessarily getting anything new here. However, thanks to a glitch with the achievements on the Xbox Series X and Xbox One, I had to play it a second time almost immediately, which I wasn't necessarily stoked about. Out of the 14 achievements in Hellblade, 13 of them are tied to the story, which makes sense. The game is the story and vice versa. The only one you won't get if you play the game all the way through is the one for collecting the lore stones. All of the others pop when you beat a boss or complete an area or a trial. Or at least they do in theory. But there's a glitch that prevents them from popping if the game wasn't fully exited out of between sessions. So, if you put the Xbox in sleep mode instead of fully turning it off or quitting out of the game, then normally unmissable achievements just don't unlock. And either because I was so immersed or because I just wasn't paying attention, I somehow didn't notice until the near end of the game. Fortunately, I caught it before the last lore stone, so that wasn't a problem, but I somehow missed 10 of the 13 supposedly unmissable achievements, and there was no solution other than to play it all over again. And at that point, I was just blasting through it to get to the end because I already had my emotions beautifully manipulated by the game on the first run. So that was, not awesome. And it was in that second playthrough that I found myself wishing for collectibles or more completion-heavy elements. But overall, I wouldn't say it detracted from how effective that first run was. It took a quick game and spread it out and diluted it a little, but those feelings I initially felt were real, and that connection that the game gave me to Senua and her journey still happened, even if I didn't feel it as strongly on the second time through. It took an experience meant to last around 7 or 8 hours and ended up stretching it out closer to 16. But at the intended length of 8 or so hours, this game is short and potent enough that I would truly recommend it to anyone willing to put themselves in someone else's shoes, or who wanted to have an incredibly immersive experience that transports them to another time and place through every element of the presentation and gameplay. If you're a completionist who wants to hunt stuff down and pour hundreds of hours into a game, you're not going to find that here. But who knows? Maybe we'll find some of that in the sequel. Hellblade itself is a quick, dense, and well-researched game that will make you feel Senua's fear and despair, but also her hope and acceptance. It let me feel every step of the journey, not just into darkness, but through the darkness and out into the light.
I truly believe that Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice is the gold standard for indie games that tackle mental health as a subject. And on top of that, it's also just a good game. Even if the gameplay elements aren't groundbreaking, they're all completely unified as part of the overall journey. And I was truly sucked in by what Ninja Theory did here, and I'm still very impressed by it. Now, that glitch that messed with the achievements is a real bummer, but it only dilutes the power of the game a small amount. And assuming you can avoid it by making sure to exit the game each time you play it, it's definitely worth soaking up completely across one terrifying, heartbreaking, and ultimately cathartic and life-affirming playthrough. So, with that in mind, guys, I give this game my completionist rating of complete it.
Complete it!